A quick note that before we begin today's episode, we recorded this story about a week ago prior to Hurricane Beryl and the impacts as such. As Beryl makes landfall today, we would just like to wish everyone listening safety and security during the storm. Hopefully, the only storm the Houston region has to cope with this hurricane season. However, as the season is predicted to be one of the busier ones, we are thinking of you, and our thoughts and hopes are with you as we navigate the storm together. So we wish you safety and security. And with that said, we'll go into today's pre-recorded story. Over the course of January 10th, 2017, Oxbow Calcining, a pet coke plant in Port Arthur, Texas, emitted the toxic chemical sulfur dioxide in quantities up to 62% higher than federal standards permit 25 times. The plant is a notorious polluter grandfathered into existence through its construction prior to the 1970s Clean Air Act, and the EPA has tried to create separate regulations to rein in pollution at such facilities across the country. In the case of Oxbow, its ability to work with the TCEQ, or Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, has meant the plant has been able to evade regulations and likely mask pollution levels by manipulating their production to match weather patterns. This story, the result of deep investigative reporting and data analysis by two reporters at the nonprofit environmental news organization Grist, shines a light on how polluters are able to evade regulations and even work with state governments to try and hide emissions from monitors. Today on the program, we're sitting down with the reporters behind the Oxbow story to learn more. I'm Weston Twardowski, an instructor in and associate director of Rice University's Center for Environmental Studies and the associate director of Eco Studio in Rice's Sustainability Institute. And you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoyed the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Oxbow Calcining Plant, which produces pet coke, a product used to power steel and aluminum manufacturing, has for years worked to avoid new federal regulations around air quality. New reporting by Navina Sadasubam and Clayton Aldern sheds a light on how this happened and the human health implications of the plant on South Texas, along with similar facilities in Louisiana and Oklahoma. And Navina Sadasubam and Clayton Aldern, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
So just to start us off, can you introduce yourselves a little to our listeners and tell you both about your work at Grist, but also your broader kind of work as environmental journalists, and really what got you started digging into this Port Arthur story?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. I'm a senior staff writer here at Grist, mostly writing accountability, investigative stories, often centering on the oil and gas industry and the petrochemicals industry, but not always. And I've been at Grist for 5 years. And prior to that, I was at the Texas Observer, Inside Climate News, and ProPublica.
And I'm a data reporter at Grist. I don't have a beat per se. I mostly work with a method, which is that of figuring out how to combine the tools of contemporary data science with the traditional tools of investigative journalism. So sometimes I'm thinking about oil and gas, but other times I'm thinking about climate science. Sometimes I work on biology stories. I recently published a book on the relationships between climate change and brain health. That's an interest of mine. But mostly when it comes to journalism, I'm thinking about how we can use these vast data sets available to us to build up a statistical understanding of the world.
Well, and I mean, that's really central to this piece that you wrote in Grist, really focusing in on a lot of data analysis, mapping out a history of regulation evasion or outright some problematic things that were happening there that you were really able to evidence through a lot of that data. So I'm curious what first drew your attention to this Port Arthur plant, and if you can just walk us through a little bit of what you found, what drew your mind there, and then in your investigation, what you uncovered.
Sure. So I mentioned that I previously worked at the Texas Observer, and I used to live in Austin and cover the state of Texas. And Oxbow repeatedly during that time would come up in all kinds of environmental reports that advocates were putting together or the state agency was sort of putting together. And it was often one of the biggest polluters in the state, right? A massive source of sulfur dioxide. I think it's the fourth largest in its county. It's the largest in its county and fourth largest in the state. So I was familiar with the facility, but hadn't done a whole lot of digging into it, and came across some local news articles, and one of my sources happened to mention that he had heard of a petrochemical refinery evading a monitor. He couldn't remember exactly where the facility was or what it was called or anything like that, but he said, you should talk to this other person in Port Arthur and he's going to tell you all about it. So I call up this other source and he says, yes, we've been following this case for a long time. You should look at these lawsuits that have been filed by this company's contract, a company that Oxbow contracts with. And so it was in examining those lawsuits that I discovered that there was a really good story to tell here that hadn't already been told. That lawsuit had been covered by local press, but primarily it was being presented as a he said, she said sort of story where these two companies were fighting in court. There were financial incentives at play. And so they were sort of presenting it as, one company says the other one is evading an air monitor. You be the judge of what's going on. But in looking at the lawsuit documents, I discovered that there was just a treasure trove of data in there that could help us arrive at a more credible answer to some of the questions that people had that nobody had previously looked at, it seemed like. And so that was really the start of the story. And that's and it's at that point that I brought Clay on to say, hey, can we look at this 8,000-page PDF that is actually a spreadsheet that someone has printed out as a PDF? And can we go through this data and see what we can find?
This is very old school journalism. We're digging into the PDF printout and breaking things down some. Can you walk us through a little bit of, so you're talking about Oxbow Calcining in Port Arthur. What is the purpose of this plant, and how long has it been there in causing these problems?
Yeah, it's been around for a few decades. It's a petroleum coke refining facility, and pet coke is really the bottom of the barrel product that's spit out from crude oil. It has a really high sulfur content, and what this facility does is it takes the pet coke, heats it up to really high temperatures, higher than 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and then waits for all of that sulfur dioxide to sort of combust. The sulfur content oxidizes and becomes sulfur dioxide. And when that happens, it changes the form of pet coke and makes it just a better heat source. And so that's what this facility is doing, is it's refining and pet coke, and in the process releasing a ton of sulfur dioxide.
And what are some of the implications of sulfur dioxide? I know in the article you go into this, but for listeners, what are some of the concerns that local communities have around all that sulfur dioxide?
Yeah, sulfur dioxide is a respiratory irritant. It has a terrible smell. It smells sort of like rotten eggs. And yeah, it's not great for your lungs. It has it causes asthma. It can cause trouble breathing. And some of the residents, the sulfur dioxide levels in coming from this one plant were so high that sometimes it would leave sort of this yellow residue on cars, on front porches.
Wow.
That's the amount of sulfur dioxide that we're talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, I know in the article you go into some of the various, implications around these pollutants. You also note that the community directly next to this or closest in proximity is majority Black. I think you write like high majority Black community. And so we're really thinking about this as an environmental justice issue as well. But, you mentioned, asthma and elevated cancer risks in neighboring communities. There's a really kind of powerful quote at the end where you're talking to someone local who's telling you, it's a town of, not that many people, 50, 60,000 people. And everyone knows someone who's being hospitalized for cancer, which is really just stunning. And so, I mean, I think there's, obviously these major health implications, and thank you for giving us a little bit of both what the purpose of the plant is in that history. But I mean, I think a lot of what you're digging into, and especially where that data comes in, is thinking about how this particular plant has been skirting regulations. And so, can you walk us through a little bit of where you found evidence and what that evidence looks like that there was a deliberate effort here to avoid some of those federal regulations, some of the TCQ, Texas Commission on Environmental Quality regulations?
Yeah, absolutely. So like as I mentioned previously, this 9,000 page PDF had a data set that showed you the internal working of the plant, which is really quite rare. It's very rare to find all of this information about how a facility is running on a minute by minute basis. That data set covered 2.5 years worth of emissions from that plant. And it had a breakdown in 5-minute increments. And what it told you is, what the sulfur dioxide reading was from a monitor that was placed by the state agency near the plant. And at the same time, every time a reading was taken, what the wind direction was, what the wind speed was, and also whether their 4 kilns were on or off at any given time. So what you could start to see is there were times when the kilns were being turned off. And the question then naturally arose, are these kilns being turned off when the wind is blowing in the direction of the monitor and carrying that sulfur dioxide to the air quality monitor, where it can be picked up and where regulators can look at it, and where the company can face consequences as a result, right? And that's where Clay started sort of putting together these windrows plots. And I don't know, Clay, if you want to take it from there and explain, how you dug through that data.
Yeah, happy to. Right. So we have measurements of kiln operations at 5-minute intervals for 2 years. Right. So this is tens of thousands of data points. And from this mess, we wanted to try to understand what kinds of statistical relationships we could tease out of these tens of thousands of points. And so one of the first things to do in a situation like this is kind of throw all your data on a page and see what it looks like. And when it comes to point source emissions data, and in particular, point source emissions data that may be distributed by the wind, one of the ways of looking at those data is via what's called a windrows plot. You've probably seen something like this before. It looks a little bit like a compass if there was a bar chart wrapped around it. And what it does is it bins data points as a function of wind direction. And the higher the bar, the more data points that are observed as a function of that wind direction. And what we see when we start to place these data points, and in particular, measurements of sulfur dioxide recorded at the monitor in question, for example, around the windrows, we start to notice some baseline observations. So, for example, it seems to be the case that when you look at these windrows plots, there's a bias, right? There's a directional bias in terms of observed readings. Now, part of that bias makes sense, right? Because the geography of the region is going to be suggestive of a certain baseline distribution of wind directions and wind speeds, right? It perhaps makes sense that the plant is operating in a given regime at a given time of the day, which may bear no relation to the wind whatsoever. So we have to establish these original observations, these biases, in effect, that might help us paint a picture of what's going on when human behavior enters the fray, right? So when we take a peek at those windrows plots, when we build these kind of basic estimates of a statistical description of what's happening at the site, what we notice is that effectively when there are fewer kilns on, there's less SO2 observed at the monitor. Okay, so that makes sense. And when high winds are blowing to the north, right, and the monitor is north of the kilns in question, we see more SO2 observed at the monitor. Again, we would also expect that. Once we establish those baseline relationships, then we can start to ask more complicated questions about, for example, what's happening at each individual kiln for a given reading observed at the monitor. So we want to kind of inverse the problem, right? We don't want to necessarily try to predict SO2 levels as a function of kiln state. What we want to do is try to predict kiln state, right? What's happening at the plant as a function of everything else that's happening in the environment, including the readings to which we have access, the wind speed and direction, the degree to which that wind direction might be changing, right? Because the wind doesn't just blow in one direction all day. So we also want to basically take the derivative of wind direction. When you throw all of these predictors into a bucket, our bucket is called a random forest model. It's a type of machine learning model. When you do so and you try to use the environmental variables to predict the state of what's going on in that plant, i.e. whether or not any given kiln is on or off at any given point in time, what you observe is that you can do a lot better than chance in predicting the state of these kilns. And in particular, wind direction, measured SO2, again, the degree to which that direction is changing, they're all predictive of kiln state, which is to imply that there's likely some kind of causal relationship between these variables and the behaviors that we're observing at the kilns. And that would appear to suggest that some type of human intervention is occurring, because given that these behaviors are being observed at levels far greater than chance, there's almost no other explanation that would link something like wind direction to kiln behaviors, right?
So can you walk me through? I mean, so what I'm gathering from this is, when the wind is blowing in the direction of the monitor, which the plant knows where the monitor is, there's behavioral changes happening where some of these big smokestacks are being turned off. So can you walk me through, though, why, I mean, I think I can guess, but, why are we turning smokestacks off when we know the airflow is going to carry it more directly towards the monitor?
Right. Of course, the implication here is that there are permitted levels with respect to air quality, safety, operations, et cetera, that the facility in question is required to meet. And that is, of course, why the monitor is there in the first place. And the kind of nefarious argument here would be that in order to stay below the permitted thresholds in question, when meteorological information indicating wind direction, for example, is available to operators, in order to artificially depress the emissions in question as observed at the monitor, if instead you made some kind of behavioral change in your plant, the wind, as it shifts north toward that monitor, carries less of the emissions in question, thereby artificially registering a lower emissions level, and in theory, one below your permitted levels. Does that kind of capture the nefarious theory here, Navina?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. So the other aspect of this that we found through the documents that were in the lawsuit is also that, there was, along with the data, there was a treasure trove of emails that showed you the correspondence between Oxbow employees as this monitor was coming online. There was a lot of hand-wringing about this monitor that the state agency was going to set up outside their facility in 2017, right? So in the lead up, in the months leading up to that air monitor coming online, there's a lot of discussion of, what do we do about this monitor? And one of the responses to that was to ask the state agency whether they could have a direct link to the air monitor so that they could record those 5-minute data intervals, right? So they wanted to pull sulfur dioxide readings directly from the air monitor and have sort of direct access to that monitor, which is something that the public does not have. I think that's a really important point to make, which is that, you and I can go on the TCEQ website and look at that air monitor right now, and we would get 1-hour averages. We do not have that level of granularity in terms of sulfur dioxide readings coming from that monitor. But the company was able to convince the agency to let them have that access. And what was also interesting is that this facility is the only one in the state to have that kind of access to an air quality monitor that the state set up. So there's no other facility that's been given this kind of access. And so I think that is also somewhat telling.
Well, I mean, you also, I think, at one point note, this is the really the plant you're focusing on and your attention, but there's also similar plants in Louisiana and Oklahoma owned by the same company. And if the Oklahoma one, I think you point out that there was an internal complaint to the Oklahoma Environmental Authority around the fact that the company there was explicitly doing this, was using that internal that data that was being given, and so Oklahoma actually stopped providing that data, whereas it seems like Louisiana and Texas were still doing so.
Exactly. That's exactly right. So there's a similar coke calcining facility, one in Louisiana and another one in Oklahoma. And when these air quality monitors were coming online in early 2017, they went to state agencies in all three states and were able to get access to that kind of sort of real-time monitoring data. But in Oklahoma, someone filed an anonymous complaint with the state environmental agency and alleged that the company was using that data to essentially quote unquote, game the monitor to change its emissions based on the wind direction. And so in response to that, the state agency revoked access to that data. And said, we're not going to give you this level of granularity. It's not available to the larger public, and so we're going to take away that access from you. That complaint has not been substantiated in Oklahoma. As far as I can tell, there wasn't any other follow-up beyond just revoking access. But I think it is telling that there was sort of a similar complaint in another state.
And something similar that I want to go back to a little bit, in talking through, this is a big issue. It's a complex issue. It's a lot of regulation, but I think it points at something, certainly the really important health implications that are coming up here, but also the importance of these kind of the weird granularity of the regulation in that allows for a lot of this to happen. You actually write at one point in talking through, this is a plant that's been in our operation since like the 1930s. I mean, in some capacity. And so it's been around for a long time. And then, of course, the Clean Air Act comes in. And you write about how this plant has been grandfathered in to pre-Clean Air Act regulations. And I think the quote in the article is creating a perverse incentive to keep old and dirty plants in operation and delay upgrading them, which is fascinating and also terrifying. And so I'm wondering if you can talk how we've managed to set up a system in which we're actually, in some cases, incentivizing people not to upgrade their plants to the most modern and cleaner technologies that could protect us.
Yeah, absolutely. So when the Clean Air Act was passed more than half a century ago, I think one of the explicit conditions of industry was to allow facilities that were already operating to be grandfathered in, right? And so Oxbow Calcining, as a facility that's been operating since the 1930s, wasn't subject to the same regulations that a facility that comes online this year, for instance, would be, right? And so that's one of the reasons why it is one of the larger sulfur dioxide emitters in the state. If you were building a coke calcining plant today, you wouldn't be given a permit with SO2 thresholds as high as Oxbow has, right? It's just not possible to get that kind of permit in this day and age. But because it has been grandfathered in, its actual permits have a very high sulfur dioxide upper limit. The way that the EPA and state agencies have been trying to work around this grandfathering provision is to have rules and regulations for how much sulfur dioxide can be in the ambient air. So currently that threshold is 75 parts per million. So, your facility might have an air permit that allows you to emit thousands of tons of sulfur dioxide every year, but in order to protect public health, you're not allowed to have an ambient concentration above 75 parts per million. And this is where a facility like Oxbow gets into trouble, right? Because even though it has that permit that allows it to emit, thousands of tons, it can run into trouble with this other provision. And what we're seeing here is a company figuring out a way to get around this other rule as well.
And so, yeah, I mean, that's interesting because it also brings up, you do write a lot about various, things that could be done to try to, bring this into more existing code. Obviously, they can still exist because they've been grandfathered. But I mean, there is, I believe, at one point, there's a replacement of one of the kilns. And so, I mean, what are the changes that are happening on the ground? Are we seeing improvement, or are these things, not actually having the impact? I'm curious about, how is this plant adapting, and is it moving forward in trying to create something that is going to emit less sulfur dioxide?
Yeah, yeah, that's a
Getting
great question,
laughter. Okay.
Christian. Yeah, Claire, you want to talk about that one smokestack and what we found with it?
Yeah, I'm happy to, right? So we'd mentioned these windrows plots earlier, right?
Mhm.
Where we're taking a peek at something like the spatial distribution of SO2 readings, right? And by spatial, I mean as a function of wind direction. And we note this bias, right? This bias in terms of wind direction, such that we're seeing a lot more SO2 recorded at the monitor when winds are blowing from the south. And again, this all makes sense given the position of the monitor relative to the facility. But the off states of the kilns in question, right, when they're turned off, um, they tend to describe, spatially speaking, they tend to describe the patterns that we suss out in the rest of the piece. However, that's not true for one of the kilns, right? It's kiln 4, as it were, and it appears to have some different spatial distributions. And we kind of couldn't figure out what was going on there for a while. It appeared to be this non-uniform wind distribution, which was expected, right, given the geography of the region. But it differed meaningfully, both between kiln states, whether on or off, and also from all the other kilns. So the question here was, what the heck was going on? When is it down? Why is it down? And then we realize when we take a closer look at the data that this kiln 4 was down, right, off, as it were, when it was being rebuilt. And what happened when it was rebuilt? Effectively, the stack in question, right, the smokestack in question, and Navina, maybe you have the numbers off the top of your head, but it's raised several feet. And so given that we have measurements of what's occurring at this monitor in 2017, in 2018, and then in 2019, and given that the kiln is being rebuilt, and in effect the stack is being raised in that middle period, the question emerges: can we kind of understand the effect of that particular modification to this kiln on those biases by breaking it down on a effectively yearly basis? And indeed, as you raise your kiln height, as you raise that stack, as effectively you push those emissions further into the atmosphere, lo and behold, the biases in question disappear, right? So previously, you would see in the case of this kiln 4, a similar relationship that is observed between wind direction and wind speed and kiln behavior prior to being rebuilt. After it's rebuilt, that southerly bias disappears. And one argument would be, well, that's because there's no longer a need for any kind of behavioral intervention that diminishes observed emissions at the monitor with respect to kiln 4, because now the stack is so high that those emissions tend not to have as great of a contribution into that SO2 concentration as they otherwise would. Does that kind of capture it for you, Navina?
Yeah, it does. And just to add to that, we're observing this behavior sort of in the data, right? But it's also backed up by other records and emails that are being sent. So at one point, the company informs the state agency that they have plans to raise the stack. They're going to turn the stack off for a few months while they while they construct a taller stack, and they sent in an application to the state agency, right, saying, we want to build this new stack that is 20 feet taller, 3 feet narrower, and in that application, the plant manager states that this change will provide additional loft of the plume and, quote, provide better dispersion from the kiln for stack, which will lower off-property ambient concentrations of air contaminants, end quote. So they are well aware. They're well aware of the effect that raising the stack will decrease the levels that the monitor is going to pick up. And in fact, that is one of the reasons why they want to raise the stack height. Now, I will say this is not illegal. Raising stack heights is not illegal. Companies all across the country do it. There are limits. You can't just build a stack that's 10,000 feet high. There are some limits. I think it falls under the good engineering practice section of the Clean Air Act. And so there are some bounds, but within those bounds, they are allowed to increase stack heights. And in fact, since the Clean Air Act passed, folks have been looking at smokestack heights for coal plants, for instance, and they've seen that over time, stacks keep getting taller and taller and taller and taller. And so just to point out the obvious, this doesn't change how much they're polluting. It's just changing how those pollutants are dispersed and what the concentration is on the ground.
And our ability to detect it then. Okay. All right. That's what I was getting to is there any actual, does this actually help to mitigate any of those health impacts? Or are we just seeing, oh, this is a different way of, to some degree, getting around those air monitors, which it sounds like it's more the latter.
Yeah, in this case, it is a way to get around the air monitor. And what we don't know is, when these stacks are taller, how are these concentrations changing in the atmosphere? And, just because one particular air monitor isn't picking it up in one location does not mean that these pollutants aren't accumulating somewhere else, right? And aren't affecting a different population in a different place. So that's the big unknown.
So, I mean, one of the things that you point out is, that there's the kind of, I think what's referred to as experiments around, the practices of managing these kilns as they work through, the new air monitor. And there's a strong case that I think you make, and that some, legal experts you are in conversation with make about these represent kind of a deviation from the standard operating practice of plant, in a way that, for all this conversation we've had about the way that the plant has been grandfathered in, part of that is not supposed to be making radical changes to the plant, right? Otherwise, it would need to go past the more modern regulations. And so I'm wondering, if we're able to raise smokestacks, if we're able to kind of run these experiments and how the plant runs, how is this not eliminating kind of that grandfathering in that's been guaranteed?
Yeah, I mean, these are sort of blind spots in the Clean Air Act, right? Sort of little loopholes that are available to companies. And the company, Oxbow has always claimed that these are experiments that the facility is running so that it can operate under the law, so that it can meet these state and federal regulations, that it is finding ways to tweak its operations such that it doesn't run afoul of any of these rules or laws. And that has always been its sort of line, both in lawsuits and in responses to us.
Great. Is there anything else we should really be talking about with this plant? And maybe also, what are some of the implications we can draw from this story that we also might recognize are important, throughout the region or throughout the country as we think about how these polluting entities are functioning and what should be done?
Yeah, for me, one of the big takeaways here is just how reliant we are on industry reported data to get an understanding of whether companies are, operating within the law. And in this rare instance where we get sort of a peek behind the curtain and we get a better understanding of how a facility is being run, we see some behavior that is potentially, that's alarming. And so I would say, what we don't know is how rampant this kind of behavior is, because the incentives are such that Other companies may also be engaging in this kind of behavior. We just don't know. We don't have lawsuit documents from lawsuits to give us kind of a better understanding of what's going on within the facility. So that's kind of one of my big takeaways from working on this story. Clay, I'm curious if you have any others.
Well, I would just add that we're in a situation here, as Navina suggested, wherein we do have access to really high quality, highly granular data, which offers this insight into a phenomenon to which we wouldn't necessarily have access otherwise. And yet, even given that highly granular data, we still have to grapple with the notion of correlation versus causation, right? And we're far past correlation in our reporting, right? We have looked at these data from a variety of angles. We have corrected for multiple comparisons and dealt with temporal autocorrelation, if that means anything to anybody listening. And we have run all the statistical tests under the sun and are using quite sophisticated models. And that's all well and good. That allows us to make the kind of causal claims that we can. And yet, it's still a little bit ambiguous, right? We're always going to be left with this touch of ambiguity that says, gosh, is there any other way that these data could be observed in the manners that we're observing them? And that type of healthy skepticism, I think, is really important to apply to situations such as these, and especially to situations in which maybe you have less granular data, right? And data, for example, from point source emitters that might be sampled at less frequent intervals. We're blessed with high quality data in this case, and that allows us to really make some impressive causal claims here, I would argue. But just by way of example, right? If you take a look at SO2 measured at the monitor, the percent change in that SO2 relative to the time point at which a kiln is shut down, and you plot that measurement as a function of hours pre and post shutdown, right? So you can imagine in the middle of your chart is 0. That's the moment the shutdown occurs. To the left, that's the percent change in SO2 relative to that time point prior to shutting down the kiln. To the right, that's the measurement of SO2, the change in the measurement of SO2 post shutting down a kiln. If you imagine that chart, what you see in our data is you see a flat line that approaches 0, continues to be flat for a little bit, and then spikes post shutdown. So that's a little bit strange, right? We're describing a situation in which a kiln is shut down, and after that occurs, we see a spike in SO2. Now, that sounds a little bit counterintuitive given everything else we've discussed here, right? And in fact, if that was the only thing that you knew about this investigation, you'd really be scratching your head right now. But given that we have access to the data we do, given the other statistical models we've built of this phenomenon, we can look at a chart like that and say, oh, we don't have a counterfactual in this instance. We don't know what might have happened were these kilns not to have been shut down in those moments. But what we can presume, given all the other evidence to which we have access, is that the shutdown is preventing additional marginal SO2 from reaching that monitor in the future. That spike post-shutdown would have been even larger if the firm in question didn't have access to the kind of meteorological data that they're using to make the decisions about kiln behavior that they are, right? So that claim requires a lot of thinking, right? It requires a lot of critical analysis of both the data sets in question, the behaviors that we've heard described by community activists and legal experts, and indeed read in the emails that Navina has described. And I think it requires the healthy skepticism in question, because only having access to that last observation would, I think, point you in the wrong direction in terms of the conclusions that we ought to draw from the data. But given the complex models that one can build of causal relationships, you as a journalist begin to open yourself up to being able to make claims that I would argue do hold water despite not having access to the counterfactuals in question. So, this is a very long way of saying, in terms of thinking about other investigations along these lines to, in which other people might be interested or to which they might have relevant data access. The correlation causation bifurcation to me is very frequently a little squishier than statisticians, or at least popular media statisticians, make it out to be. In practice, I would argue that you can very frequently verge on causality when you do have healthy skepticism in play and a bevy of models to back you up. It's what allows you to be able to make claims sometimes in absence of counterfactuals.
No, I so appreciate that. And I appreciate you, both walking us through and the deep thought into those. Yeah, really, I mean, it's one of the constant struggles is that we can't directly attribute this thing that makes a lot of sense as a cause. But, when we're talking about big environmental questions and, what directly caused someone's cancer, for instance, it's really, really hard to nail that down. And so we do have to turn to these larger models. So I just want to thank you for both coming on and sharing all of this, excellent investigative journalism and sharing your time and the story with our listeners. So Navina Sadasavam and Clayton Aldern, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Now we'll go to our researcher, Caroline Pollan, who has a piece all about bees in Texas and why their populations are incredibly on the rise in really astounding numbers. Caroline, take it away.
My name is Caroline Pollan, and I'm a researcher here at Gulf Streams. Texas is a huge state for agriculture. I mean, even just driving between Houston and Austin, I can attest to witnessing endless cattle ranches after pasture lands, after cornfields and cotton fields. Agriculture is a huge part of Texas's economy, politics, land use, and is a way of life for so many. Here at Gulf Streams, we've done stories on various aspects of agriculture before, but we haven't yet discussed one of the most important but most overlooked livestock, honeybees. I'm here today with Emily Foxall, a climate reporter with the Texas Tribune, who has done some coverage on the boom in Texas beekeeping and the legislature that has enabled it. Welcome to Gulf Streams. Could you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Hi, my name's Emily Foxall. I cover climate change for the Texas Tribune.
Awesome, thank you. There are some pretty startling statistics on this increase in beekeeping in Texas. You write that in 2012, there were 1,851 beekeeping operations in Texas, and that just 10 years later in 2022, Texas is now home to 8,939 operations, largely due to this so-called bee bill imposed in 2012. Could you share with us some background on the legislature tax break for beekeeping?
Sure. We were pretty amazed by those numbers too. And they came out of a Washington Post article where one of their data writers kind of dug through this census of agriculture numbers. And he pegged that increase, like you said, to 2012, which was when this new law went into effect that allowed beekeepers to qualify for lower taxes if they had a certain number of beehives on a certain amount of land. So, like I said, we got curious, and it turned out to be a pretty surprising story to me. There was a man who's a wildlife biologist. His name is Dennis Herbert, and he had been kind of managing or overseeing natural resources at Fort Cavazos, used to be known as Fort Hood. So in that job, he was really focused, on fish or deer or wildlife on that property. But when he retired, he suddenly took an interest in bees. And he told me about how he started learning about bees and the problems facing bees. And so he sort of became like this hobbyist beekeeper. So while that's going on, he also had a store where he sold various Texas art. And one day a woman comes in looking for what he remembered. She was looking for things to decorate her office. And they got to talking, and it turned out she was the chief of staff for a new Texas lawmaker. And it also happened that she, growing up, was a a beekeeper, helped keep bees with her dad as a child and had all these really fond memories. So of course they get to talking and realize they have this in common. And one thing leads to the next, and Dennis tells her, it really doesn't seem fair that beekeepers don't qualify for the same tax reductions that other ranchers or people who keep livestock already got under Texas law. And that resonated with her. She took it to her boss, and that resonated with him. And within one session, they had passed this new language to change the law to allow beekeepers to qualify.
That's such a cool story. I loved reading about it. I was like, this is so cool.
Yeah.
And in researching this piece, I actually learned a lot about the beekeeping industry that I was unaware of, and it's fascinating and in many ways critical to our agriculture. For our listeners who are unfamiliar, could you explain a bit about how these beekeeping operations work, particularly the smaller scale operations that Texans might be undertaking to qualify for tax breaks?
Sure. There were sort of two big ways I found in my reporting that this law changed the way beekeeping was happening. One of them, as you mentioned, is sort of, I think of them as like novice beekeepers, these people who started looking online for beekeeping 101 classes and really didn't know much about beekeeping beyond maybe knowing they liked honey or thinking bees were cute or having a memory of being stung by one once. So there's all these people around the state who, there's a financial interest for them in trying to save some money on their taxes. And that kind of motivated them. Some of them also had environmental, concerns, but that motivated them to try to learn how to be beekeepers. So all of a sudden, you've got these new people getting into beekeeping. And they're keeping, it's not a whole lot of hives, but some number depending on the county that you're in. And I went to one of these classes, and it's not like it's no work, it's not like you sit the hive up and walk away and that's all you have to do. You have to really check on them and feed them and make sure they have water. So there's a good bit of work involved. And then the other bucket I kind of looked at in this story was how these commercial beekeepers, so people who have huge operations with lots and lots of bees that they're managing, their business benefited because number one, they could start to sell bees and bee equipment to these new people getting into it. And some of them teach classes too. But they also started getting phone calls from people. Sometimes it was people who tried to be beekeepers and they gave up because it was too hard. And other times it was people who just didn't even want to mess with it and they wanted a professional beekeeper to come put bees on their land. So that's kind of the general landscape of what I found.
Yeah, thank you. I'm also aware that there has been some opposition from various parties to this increase in honeybee operations that have been encouraged or enabled by this tax break. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I'd say overwhelmingly people found a lot of positives with this. Maybe to back it up, like there was a researcher I talked to who kind of walked me through these various factors that we're facing bees right now. So some of those are they're losing habitat because we're developing over so much land. Pesticides that people spray on their plants can harm bees. Climate change is causing all of these floods that might wash away or topple over a beehive. It's causing drought that might make there be less nectar. And then there's this pest called a varroa mite, which I didn't know much about, but it actually feeds on bees. So it harms them that way, but it transmits a bunch of diseases. So the spread of that mite has also contributed to problems facing bees. And this researcher was telling me that on average, 30 to 45% of colonies die. So that's the entire bee colony dying every year. So it's really staggering losses that beekeepers have been facing and fighting back against. So that's kind of the backdrop, which is to say there's reasons that honeybees were needing some help. But there are concerns with this program, and one of them has to do with that varroa mite that Some people worry with these kind of newbies getting into beekeeping. They aren't adequately checking and monitoring for these pests. So maybe there's kind of these guidelines on how to keep the spread of disease down. And if people aren't keeping up with that, that could be a problem. The other issue people mentioned is sort of this like overcrowding of bees. Some of these places I went to, it's sort of like a subdivision where people have big lots they're keeping bees on. And if there's too many in one area, there might not be enough forage, enough natural forage. So you would need to start feeding them, I think is kind of the way people said they address that.
Yeah, thank you. Another aspect of like some of the issues that might arise from too many honeybees. So like you mentioned, honeybees are also in trouble. I've seen those stickers and t-shirts all over the place, like saying save the bees. As we've discussed, honeybees, they're important for crop growing. And they are facing challenges, climate change, pesticide use, the varroa mites you mentioned. But what many people outside of the world of ecology and conservation may be unaware of is that the honeybee, it's not native to here. It's native to Europe, and it isn't necessarily the bee species we need to be focusing all our efforts on saving. North America is actually home to more than 3,600 species of native bees and countless other native pollinators, many of which are increasingly coming under threat from those same pressures: habitat loss, climate change, pesticide usage, and actually infection from these diseases that are affecting honeybees. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between honeybees and native bees and how this beekeeping tax break may impact our native bees and by extension, our native ecosystems.
I'm glad you brought that up because you made me feel like this is a great follow-up story. I heard a bit about that after my story published, but it's honestly not something my reporting delved a whole lot into. We were really interested in this as you began this conversation, this kind of huge increase in beekeeping operations and what that meant for the honeybee themselves. But I think that issue you raise is a great question because of course there's a limited amount of forage in some of these areas, and we have to think about ecosystems holistically. So I think I've got some more reporting cut out for me on this topic, and it's definitely a great question to be considering.
Yeah, in like researching this piece, I sort of went down the rabbit hole of researching native bees, and there's some really cool species out there. There's some like giant bumblebees, and they're just like so cute. And there's these really tiny little bees, and they have these fascinating life cycles and interactions with native plants. So they're really cool to learn more about. I have one last question. So based on your research into this topic, what do you think the future holds for these Texas bees? Do you think we will continue to see growth in beekeeping across Texas?
I think that's a great question. Some of the beekeepers I talk to kind of are always concerned that the state legislators are going to peel back this law. So they've always got an eye out for that. But the way the data looked, it was really like a steady increase. So I'll be curious to follow if that increase can continue so much, maybe as people continue to learn about this. But what you've been saying just made me think, when I went to this beekeeping class, it was really kind of infectious, the enthusiasm people had. It was people of all ages from all backgrounds. And we all put on these big old beekeeping suits, they're these big white kind of tough fabric suits with the hood with the mesh over your face. And there was some like feeling of nervousness because when you get up there, the bees are kind of swirling all around you and they're can get kind of loud. But I also left with this total sense of awe, as you're saying, and kind of respect for these tiny little insects. And beekeepers will tell you that, one of them was telling me just how he kind of fell in love with them at a young age because they do so much good for people in pollinating our crops to help us have the fruits and vegetables we sort of take for granted, so uh, I'm curious what the future will hold, but just having had that experience myself, it made me understand, sort of respect why people can get hooked on being beekeepers.
I know, I totally relate to that. Like, of course, I would love the opportunity to go to a beekeeping class, but just like doing this research, I was like, well, man, I would love to have a beehive. And then I remembered I'm a college student and I live in a dorm, and I doubt that would be enthusiastically met by my roommate. So, but yeah, thank you so much for agreeing to do this interview. This has been super fun and super informative.
Thanks for having me. It was really great to talk to you.
Finally, we'll turn to our researcher, Jessica Shu, who will tell you about how you can get involved in Houston this week. So for today's How to Get Involved in Houston, it would seem inappropriate not to mention we are under a active hurricane watch in the middle of a storm as this is airing. And so I would encourage listeners to do the things that we Gulf Coast Southerners so typically do during hurricane season of caring for each other, preparing for the next storms, making sure that our friends and neighbors are secure. Call your loved ones, call neighbors, check in, make sure that folks have food, water, supplies as necessary if the storm is severe. And if it's not, think about ways to prepare for the next storm that we may be coming across. The Red Cross, of course, has wonderful resources. Local blood banks are excellent sites to support one's neighbors through. We are, as Gulf Southerners, too often called upon to assist our friends and loved ones and neighbors, but it's also a condition of where we live. So we are thinking of you. We are here with you today as the storm comes through. And if you want to get involved in Houston this week, I am sure there are no shortage of opportunities. The thing I would say is if you have access to power, to always make sure to sign up for your local council members' newsletter. Every council member in Houston has a regular newsletter that goes out, often weekly, sometimes monthly, but especially around severe weather times. Those newsletters have really important information in advance of storms, but also significant information on how to get involved and what can be done to support each other after. So that's our tips on what to do right now all around us. Thanks. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081 or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies, with support from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski, co-produced by Joseph Campana, audio engineer Rico Enriquez, research support provided by Alex Little, Caroline Pollen, and Jessica Shu. Stay tuned for the R&R Show with Ronnie Renfro and Tom Richards here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.